Small Changes by Digits 27, Chapter 47, Official Incursions. Observing the clash of personalities between Haya and Sukaro had quickly become the highlight of Naruto's day. His little sister had been making strides in learning the various social cues necessary to interact with normal people. However, she tended to retreat in on herself when presented with something unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Haya was most certainly one of those things. The silver bundle of pure energy had long put the business of her clan behind her in favor of awe at her new sister figure. The very fact that Sukara seemed so withdrawn, in stark contrast to most of the female figures in her life, only seemed to encourage her. Sneaking up on the blonde had turned into her new favorite pastime when the older Namikaze wasn't around. Although the first time she did this hadn't been so humorous, as it was a potential lethal incident, Sukara still had some difficulty not equating surprises with ambushes. Still, it was worth all the awkwardness to watch Sahaya zip around the room, pelting the former Rudnin with peas launches from a spoon, the look of sheer concentration occasionally marred by exclamations of childish frustration as Sukara easily slapped the makeshift projectiles away from her without looking up from her reading was priceless. Anko had taken to subtly helping the girl, maneuvering Sukaro into situations where her concentration was split before releasing the little demon on her. The house hadn't felt so alive in months. Naruto's hand whipped out, catching a different pea just in time to stop it ricocheting off an Ambu's mask. Morning, Tora. He couldn't engage the man's reaction from behind the mask, but the slight clearing of his throat told him enough to make him smile. Sir, the alarms in Tunnel 5 have been triggered. The good humor immediately drained from Naruto's face. Right, get the teams in position as planned. The Ambu touched his chest in silent acknowledgement of the order before vanishing as suddenly as he had arrived. The red-haired Hokage drummed his fingers along his thigh for a moment, catching the look Anko was giving him from across the room. She mouthed, Danzo, questionably, suppressing a frown when he nodded back. After a moment, though, she gave a small smile of encouragement, conveying with her eye alone that she would watch the girl while he was gone. With a final smile of thanks, Naruto mimed her a cheeky kiss before vanishing from the house. Thankfully, the girls were too engaged with their vegetable-themed conflict to notice. Out on the rooftops, he could already see the signs of his orders being carried out. The civilians, and even most of the shinobi, wouldn't notice anything different, but there was a certain flow to the movement of the Ambu flitting across the rooftops. The quiet repositioning of key shinobi was supposed to be low-key. It was a dangerous tactician they were dealing with. Still, Naruto couldn't fight back the satisfied smirk as Danzo rose to his bait. The man clearly thought him above the Hokage, but pride was a vice that Naruto intended to punish the man for. The day following Tsukaru's rescue had been an embarrassment for the Black Ops, as the extent of Danzo's operation had been revealed. Miles of underground tunnels and bunkers were rivaling the civilian shelter system itself. The fact that all of this had been happening literally under their noses for who knew how long was like a punch in the gut to anybody who presided over the village's safety. The survey of the complex had been thorough, with every nook and cranny scoured for any hint of where Danzo may have gone, and just what he was doing down there. The answers mostly were unsatisfying. The old politician had covered his tracks well. However, Naruto knew from experience that no contingency was perfect, and if he left the man an inch to finish the job, he was bound to snatch the chance. While the Ambu searched the complex from within, Naruto called in a favor to have the facility searched from above with the Byakugan. The dojutsu usually wasn't too good at seeing through a certain thickness of earth, but that could be compensated if the user knew what to look for. A few of the more secretive escape tunnels and what a security nightmare those were had been located by the Hyuga and purposely ignored by the Ambu. Danzo, or one of his agents, had just strolled right into one of them as if he owned the place, and Naruto was going to let him know just how big of a bear trap he had stepped in. Already, Ambu were shifting about, relieving those whose skill sets were more inclined towards capturing so they could flood the complex. Really, the man had been so overconfident with his special ward system that could counter the Horizon. A better Fuinjutsu user would have known to layer their defenses instead of trying to weave them into a single, more complex matrix. It was certainly stronger, but far less secure. Once Naruto had access to even a small part of his seal, he had access to all of it. Currently, the silent alarms that should have been going off with the intrusion of that many Anbu were deactivated, as were the Horizon blockers. As if to prove as much, he suddenly appeared alongside a small group of Anbu, headed by Komachi, racing through the tunnels to their designated staging ground. No words had to be spoken, and they were completely nonplussed by his appearance, simply carrying on until they were in their designated positions. They waited there, each second seeming to stretch and on endlessly until Naruto received the signal that everyone was in position. He made a simple motion with his hand before straightening, taking a moment to set his features into a congenial smile and walking around the corner. Evening, Danzo. The figures sedatively making their way through the streets was distinctive in their almost single-minded path towards the center of the village. The Ombuk had flagged them quickly, although none could explain or account for where the person had come from. In their simple dark robe and wide-brimmed sukigasa, their figure and any other discernible feature were indistinct. Despite their innocuous appearance, even the surrounding civilians parted for them, feeling the indistinct weight of the figure's movements. Ambu didn't interact with the citizenry as a rule, so it was with curiosity that they watched the nearby Jonin meander his way over. The figure didn't seem inclined to stop for him until he purposely cleared his throat. "Can I help you?" He tried to peer under the hat, but the figure's long hair and effeminate features were observed by the tassels dangling from the edge. He couldn't make out much about their appearance. You will move out of my path." The voice didn't help much either. It was monotone and completely androgynous, if a bit on the deeper side. The Jonin frowned lightly, but tried to keep his face jovial. It didn't do to upset the civilians if a situation was brewing. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to step to the side for a moment for a quick chat, all right?" The reaction from the rude operatives Danzo had brought with him was predictable to the point of banality. Two immediately rushed the thread, while one dropped back to cover Danzo's escape back down the tunnel. Nata didn't even have to move, as the first was neatly dispatched by a flurry of electrified senbon, dropping him to a twitching mass on the floor. The second learned nothing from his partner's fate and began rushing through hand seals. The moment his hands came up, though, a thin strip of earth whipped out of the ground, wrapping around the operative's wrist before suddenly yanking him back down to the stone floor. His mask was shattered by the impact, revealing the face of an unconscious young teen with mousy hair. The last of the operatives, at least in this room. If the other Ombu had done their jobs, the worst were being systematically captured throughout the rest of the complex. Was brought up short. Then the walls suddenly sprouted wood limbs, reaching out to tangle him up. Tenzo sprouted out of a thick bough like a flower. A moment later, promptly knocking the Rutanen out before he could activate the seal on his tongue. All of this had happened seemingly without Naruto having to lift a finger. "That's better, don't you think?" he asked the man who was only now turned around to face him again, features seemingly nonplussed, a bit more conductive to a conversation. "It seems you have been more successful than I had anticipated in getting young Sukaru to reveal Root's operation procedures," Danzo mused calmly. "I assume then you also know that I can activate everyone's operated suicide seal with a moment's thought." Naruto just grinned. "Oh, please go ahead. I'm actually quite curious about which is faster. Your thoughts?" He idly flipped a kunai prodded from thin air between his hands. "Or my hand." Danzo gave him a disdained look down his nose, but his silence was telling. "So, about that talk." The Ambu on the roof tensed slightly as the figure in the middle of the road continued to remain put. The civilians were beginning to notice the brewing situation. A few subtle moving into side streets, and a circle had begun to open around the stranger and the Jonin. "Please, I must insist you step to the side of the street for a moment. You are causing a disturbance." The figure merely glanced about, ignoring the ninja, and instead taking in the nervous glances of the people around them. Even here, the people know when they are in a greater presence. There was no visible sign of it, but the stranger seemed to affirm something in their head. This is far enough then. By now the Jonin was visibly tense, hands straining into his kunai pouch as even more citizens got the message and began to stream away from the potential fight. Did you just think you would get away with it? All these kids you've stolen from their families. Naruto's tone was conversational, but his eyes were cold as he glared at the man. He had wanted to control him a bit more, to play this out a bit. Looking at Danzo, though, it brought back that surging anger he had felt upon first seeing his sister in full. It was all he could do, not to just end the man where he stood. You are such a disappointment, Danzo said slowly, eyeing up the redhead as if he had all the time in the world. Your father, while idealistic and naive, was an apparition to our nation's enemies, a bulwark against the thought of attack. The man grimaced. Face Konoha, and you faced the yellow flash. I thought this might lead to a generation of weakened, reliant shinobi, but then came you Itachi and Shisui, such promising talent, all too quickly taken under the wing of Hiruzen's damned ideals. Is this seal going anywhere, or Danzo ignored him, straightening as though he were giving one of his speeches to the Shinobi Council. I had maintained hope you three would prove me wrong, that outside of my influence others might come to understand the necessity of our work. Something that might have passed for wistfulness drifted through the old man's face. The roots feeding the leaves. But no, when Shisui proved difficult and Itachi too patriotic, Naruto's eyes narrowed a fraction. I was left with you. I'm quite fond of the arrangement myself, he quipped, more by reflex than anything else. You have your mother's wit, if nobody has ever told you that before, Danzo continued, lip twitching with disdain. Another promising asset you so uselessly wasted, but Mito always was a political player of unequaled skill. No, I knew that if I wanted in Uzumaki, there's only one way. I don't believe I was the only one to benefit from the Kyuubi's attack. But when shinobi can't make the best out of a crisis, we are hardly fitted of the name. By now, Naruto's hand was twitching to launch a kunai into the man's throat, cut off the monologue the old-fashioned way. Those who endure. Again, that strange melancholic expression twisted his features. Perhaps the only thing Hiruzen and I ever truly agreed on. Really, I'm sorry to think this is just the rambling of senility. If you're stalling for time, I feel I should let you know that any and all of your agents are being rounded up as we speak. Danzo's visible eye narrowed slightly. I don't doubt you and your father shared a certain prodigious talent for tactics. Strategy, on the other hand, that was always Hiruzen's game. As for Stalin, my boy, you haven't the faintest idea. You think me foolish enough to place myself in such a vulnerable position without contingencies? I am so many steps ahead of you, it's almost laughable. Why did you think I chose now, of all times, to return? There was no longer any doubt that this was an incident of some sort. Anbu had actually congregated on the street, and it was almost a bad sign when a Black Ops member touched Konoha soil. The figure still stood there, calmly even when the Jonin was anything but. Remove your hat and cloak, then lie down on the ground, hands where I can see them. The figure paused a moment, considering the order. Very well, this has gone far enough. They removed their hat, carelessly tossing it to the side. Many of the Anbu watching grimaced at the sight beneath. Konoha shall know pain. I admire the bluster, Danzo. I'm sure whatever you've planned is just spectacular. Naruto drawled, motioning for the accompanying Anbu to file into the room and surround the man. Danzo himself seemed unruffled, glancing at each of them in turn as he was slowly surrounded before returning his attention to Naruto. It is unwise for leader to leave his village unattended for so long. There are visitors knocking at the door. Naruto only had a moment to furrow his brow at the cryptic statement before the entire room shuddered from some titanic explosion above them. Dust and pieces of the ceiling rained down in showers, forcing Naruto to dive to the side, tackling one of his operatives out of the path of a chunk of fallen masonry. By the time he had regained his bearings, Danzo had vanished. Naruto had a sinking feeling he wouldn't show up again. They had secured every exit, but this was Danzo's base at the end of the day. More pressing matters were required his attention though, and after a lightning-fast sweep of the room to check on his Anbu guard, he flashed back up to the surface. It was pandemonium. Shinobi flitted with this way and that, sometimes carrying civilians away from scenes of carnage, as what looked to be enormous summons animals carved in messy paths through the village. Other teams of Anbu were struggling to contain the beast, missing the large chunk of their force Naruto had brought down into the tunnels. It had all the trappings of an invasion, but There was no sign of the opposing force. He managed to flag down a passing Kunoichi. The bright red hat slung over his back was good for that at least, to give him a situation report. It's the Katsuki. We tried to stop one of them, but he summoned more. Summoned them like contract animals. They're too powerful. They keep swatting aside people who try and stop them, and not to raise the hand, silencing the woman immediately. Calm down. After a few shaking breaths, she managed that. Now, how many are there? Where are they? And what are they doing? It took her another moment to comfort herself, looking a little red in the face after realizing how she had been addressing the Hokage. We think about 6 of them, Hokage-sama. They scattered as soon as they were summoned, and right now it looks like they are trying to cause as much chaos as possible. Naruto processed all of that as quickly as possible. 6 Akatsuki, that was a lot of firepower. He hadn't thought they even had that many members left. Still, what did a handful of shinobi, even one that powerful, hope to accomplish in the middle of a village? An actual attack was out of the question, which left it likely it was a diversion. The Akatsuki's known goals were the Biju, but coming after him in the middle of his own village was either the height of arrogance or suicide. His eyes narrowed dangerously. He wasn't the only Jinchuriki in the village. Most of the Ambu are on the ground. Start spreading the message to divert the summon attacks instead of trying to destroy them. Keep them in a contained area until reinforcements can arrive. Continue with the evacuation. Anyone not dealing with animals, help with that. If my village is a battlefield, I want it exactly that. As few innocent casualties as possible. And the Katsuki Hokage-sama, leave that to actually. A whimsical voice cut in. If I could have a moment of your time. Naruto barely had the time to be alarmed before a hand clasped his shoulder. It felt like the world turned to trestle as he felt the unmistakable sensation of a space-time technique take hold. Not wanting to find out what would happen if he let it, he flashed to where he knew a nearby Hirashi tag was placed. The village was littered with them. When he reoriented, he saw it was another member of the Katsuki. The cloak was unmistakable. However, the orange mask swirling to a singular eye hole chilled his blood. He would recognize that description anywhere. "Aw," the man chatted playfully. "You ruined my little surprise. I had this awesome thing planned out where we'd zip away and I get to monologue all villainously and you could be the dashing hero and everything." The man's entire contents shifted abruptly, straightening from his childish slouch to bring the kunai he had placed against the kunoichi's neck even closer, drawing a thin red line across her throat. "The hard way, then." Even his voice had darkened, taking on a deeper, far more serious tone. "I think you'll know where to find me, Hokage-sama," he mocked, just as his entire body seemed to warp and twist in the air, spiraling in on itself and taking the kunoichi with him until they vanished with a whisper of displaced air. The redhead cursed, head darting this way and that as he fretted over his options. The village was under attack, and he couldn't just abandon in to go chasing after one man, but then he had some sense of just how dangerous that one man could be, and to abandon that kunoichi to her fate was like a knife in the gut. People at least were reacting to the invasion. There were troops on the ground, and Konoha was hardly lacking strong shinobi, but strong enough to fight 6 Akatsuki members. He took a deep breath to calm himself. Hiruzen's words on trusting in the people under him flashing through his mind. Jiraiya was still in the village. Tsunade was in the village. Kakashi, Kai, the Anbu, his students, all of them were strong. In that moment, he resolved himself. The Katsuki weren't fighting individual shinobi. They were fighting Konoha. He, apparently, had his own fight, and with that in mind, he turned his attention to the top of the mountain, where he knew the masked man would be waiting. He would have to make it this quick. Pain walked through the village slowly, the streets around him a scene of devastation. His cloak billowed slightly as the concussive force of one of the Azura Path's weapons sent shockwaves through the air. The defense the village was putting up was pathetic. With their vaunted Hokage's attention diverted, they were disorganized and routing. They couldn't even organize enough to contain the animal path summons, let alone stop him. No force, however great, could stand before go. Dynamic entry! Pain didn't even have the time to finish his thoughts before the diva path was caught by a thunderous kick that sent him careening back across the street. A great plume of dust and smoke rose from the crater he had made in a nearby wall. Before that, too, was pushed back by a wall of invisible force. "Yosh, the great beast of Konoha is here, villain. Prepare to be destroyed by the awesomeness of awesome fires of youth."
Pain took one look at the ridiculous specimen of a man before ignoring him entirely, directing the sure path to deal with him. However, before the mechanical body could unleash a barrage of destructive explosives, a crackling blade of lightning burst through its chest. Raikiri, Kakashi muttered disappointedly, tossing the now limp body to the side and turning to eye up the real threat. From his revealed Sharingan, it was clear the Kopinin was already taking this seriously. Ah, eternal rival, that was a most unyouthful sneak attack. You should always announce your presence with fiery zeal. Kakashi blinked lazily, never taking his eye off the diva path. Sorry, Kai, did you say something? The spandex man visibly recalled in pain, tears suddenly streaming down his cheeks. As hip as ever, my friend, but I shall not be outdone. He sobered up again, squirming himself against pain and setting into a deceptively average taijutsu stance. The Katsuki has befuddled my home, and if I am unable to defeat them here, then his further ranting was cut off when Pain grew irritated by the asinine display, lifted a single hand, and blasted the guy across the street with much greater force than he had been kicked. Shinra Tensei! Kakashi's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, doing his best to analyze what had just happened, but even his eye drew a blank. The man's chakra was strange, more like a cloud within his body than flowing through the usual pathways. There had been a brief concentration around the eyes when he performed his technique, but as for what he had actually done, the Sharingan simply drew a blank. Fancy name for its simple technique, he hazarded in his usual drawl. When in doubt, stall for a backup. Something told him he may be in a little over his head here. With it alone, I have the power to level this pitiful village. You have far more immediate concerns, however. Kakashi's eyes widened as he heard movement behind him, leaning to the side just in time for a black canister to shoot past his head. Again, Pain raised his hand, and the resultant explosion splashed harmlessly against some invisible shield in front of him. Kakashi wasn't so lucky as the sheer force of the blast threw him back. He had just enough wherewithal to twist his body out of the way of a silvery blade, landing with a grace on the other side of the man he thought he had already killed. So, since when does a hole through the chest not put someone down? He mused, nervously noting that the bald Akatsuki member in front of him looked immaculate. Even his robe was undamaged. That just seems unfair. His Sharingan caught another of the figures, a stocky man with the same orange hair and piercings as the apparent leader, retreating back into the side alley. Acting on that intuitive sense that had served him through his career, he flashed through a series of hand seals faster than most could blink and sent a large fireball hurtling after him. It was intercepted by a plump man bearing the same hair and markings. As Kakashi watched, his technique dwindled away to nothing before the man's raised hands. At that, he could only grimace. Any other broken little tricks I should know about? I am not so easily done away with, fiend, Guy bellowed as he broke free of the rubble he had been buried under, glancing around furtively at all the new faces. What's going on here, Kakashi? Spotted an opportunity, the silver-haired Jonin motioned after the fleeting figure. That one, Guy. Go after him. Yosh! Guy acted without hesitation, pumping his arms at his side as he was suddenly enveloped in a green corona. Two of the paths moved to intercept, but he shot right past them in an emerald blur, taken off after the fleeing Naraka path, which of course left Kakashi standing there, surrounded by the other three. They looked none too happy about the development. Without any outward sign of communication, the tubby one that had intercepted his technique darted off after Guy. With the one Kakashi had already killed, once launched himself forward. His hands seemed to fold back like some impossible complex puppet, revealing two spiny serrated blades. Kakashi squared himself to redirect the blades with another Rakiri, aware of how much of a dent that would put in his reserves, only to have his vision filled by a mane of white hair. The world was filled with the deafening screech of a Rasengan plunging into metal before the Ashura path had a hole punched through it. Again, the apparent mechanical person stood there a moment, Jiraiya's arm elbow deep in its chest, before weakly swinging at the Sanin only to slump to the side. Kakashi felt like burning the rest of it for good measure. You go after a bowl cut. I got this one, Jiraiya muttered softly, his voice lacking on any of its usual mirth as the older man turned to face the diva path. Face firm, Kakashi
I idly noted that Jiraiya could actually be quite commanding when he dropped the Kakashi act, but before racing after Guy. After all, if Jiraiya couldn't handle this guy, what chance in hell did he have? Jiraiya didn't have his eye, didn't take his eye off the orange-haired man as the copy nin raced off. The man seemed likewise intrigued by him. Yeah, yeah, Yahiko, he acknowledged softly. Jiraiya sensei, Pain returned, sounding almost bemused. Naruto had no horizon markers in the small forest atop the Hokage monument, so he arrived in a little clearing in a small whirl of leaves. He stood atop a tree branch, staring down at the masked man and wary for any traps he may have set up. The man himself just stood there, the now gagged Kunoichi held up by her hair with the kunai at her throat. She was trying to compose herself, getting a hopeful smile at seeing at her Hokage arrive, but she was still trembling slightly. Did I get the wrong one? The man asked, once again adopting that childish persona. You're not Shinshin no Shushi, are you? Stop messing around, Naruto said, dropping to the ground and walking forward cautiously. Attention split between the mask that set his teeth on edge and the kunai hovering ponderously like a tiny sword of the muckles. Oh, but messing around is the only fun you can have in this dull, broken world, isn't it? I wouldn't have thought you'd learn at least that from your pretty fiancée. Naruto twitched slightly, but refused to raise the bait. What do you mean? The man tutted, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. No, no, too soon. We have to draw this out, really. It's like I'm dealing with an amateur. First, I make my grand monologue speech where I lay out my plans along with all the hideously evil atrocities I've committed. Then you make a pithy retort while I lay some unseen trap. I make some grand gesture allowing you to rescue my hostage in the nick of time, followed by our amazing and climatic battle determining the fate of the village and all the lives in it. He finished with a swiping gesture of both hands, momentarily bringing the kunai away from the woman's throat. Naruto just grit his teeth, eyes darting about the clearing for any hint of an advantage. If you insist, the man's voice lost all of its playfulness in an instant. Well, now I'm not in the mood anymore. His hand felt like a pendulum, and time seemed to slow to a crawl as Naruto rocketed forward, pulling every ounce of speed out of his legs as physically possible. It took him 2 strides to streak across the open ground, leaving tiny craters where his feet met the ground. Just before the man could slice the kunoichi's throat, he tackled her backwards, the kunai leaving a neat scar across the Hokage's hat instead. When he rolled to the stop, cradling the woman in his arms, he knew something was off when the man refused to press his attack. He almost missed the faint hissing from the blood pounding in his ears, but he caught it in time to rip off the to rip off the Kunoichi's headband and fling it towards the man, sheltering her with his body. It exploded a moment later, pelting him with dirt and little clumps of earth, and leaving an incessant ringing in his ears. The man strolled out of the smoke cloud without so much as a hair out of place. Naruto could almost feel the grin beneath the mask. That's more like it. A heroic rescue, quick thinking, and a devotive trap reveal. Now I know I picked the right guy. Tokage bit back a snarl, using his opponent's flair for the dramatic to give the Kunoichi a quick once-over. She seemed alright, if a bit frightened. With that flourish. He pulled out one of his kunai, stuck it in the ground, and vanished in a flash of red, depositing the woman again amongst the surprised gasp of one of the civilian bunkers before flashing away again. The man hadn't moved in the brief moment he was gone, except to mime looking at the watch. What took you? Oh, don't worry, Naruto said, doing his best to keep his voice even. You have my full attention now. He launched forward again, a large Rasengan swirling into place over his palm as he moved. The distance between them might as well not have existed for all the time it took for him to cross it, driving the grinding ball of chakra right into the man's chest, only for it to pass right through. Oh no, it appears that the man started only to trail off when he realized the Namakase hadn't overbalanced and fallen through his body like most did. Instead, he stood there holding the screeching ball of chakra right inside his chest cavity, a small grin starting to spread his whiskered cheeks. The redhead made his masked opponent right in the eye and allowed himself a small vindictive smile. You're not the only one who's done their homework. End of chapter 47.